It began long before the first tank rolled across the desert. By early 1967, the Middle East was a powder keg. 2 decades after the founding of Israel in 1948, the region had never truly known peace. Israel's borders were surrounded by hostility. Egypt to the south, Jordan to the east, Syria to the north, each refusing to recognize its right to exist. Throughout 1966 and early 1967, skirmishes along the Israeli-Syrian border became increasingly frequent. Syrian artillery shelled Israeli farms in the Galilee, while Israeli aircraft retaliated in precision strikes. In April 1967, a fierce aerial dogfight erupted over the Golan Heights. Israeli Mirage jets shot down 6 Syrian MiG-21s, humiliating Damascus and hardening Arab resolve. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, already the most powerful Arab leader, felt compelled to act. His influence was threatened by growing Arab pressure to lead a united front against Israel. He began mobilizing his army, convinced that confrontation was inevitable. On May 16, 1967, Nasser ordered the removal of UN peacekeeping forces stationed in the Sinai Peninsula since the Suez Crisis of 1956. The United Nations Emergency Force, which had separated Egyptian and Israeli troops for over a decade, was expelled within days. For Israel, that act alone was an unmistakable signal of war. Then came the move that made war almost certain. On May 22, Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran, the narrow waterway that linked Israel's southern port of Eilat to the Red Sea. It was Israel's only route for oil imports and trade with Asia. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol called the blockade an act of war. Israel's cabinet convened daily, weighing its options as panic spread through the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Behind closed doors, Israel's military, the IDF or Israel Defense Forces, argued for a preemptive strike. Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Yitzhak Rabin, Air Force Commander Major General Motti Hod, and Armored Corps Commander Major General Israel Tal, known as Talik, presented intelligence showing Egyptian forces massing in the Sinai, 7 divisions, roughly 100,000 soldiers and 900 tanks, many Soviet-made T-54S and T-55S. Across the border, Egypt's army was joined by Syria and Jordan. Nasser's radio broadcasts echoed through the region, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel." In Amman, King Hussein of Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt on May 30, placing his army under Egyptian command. 2 days later, Iraq joined the alliance, sending expeditionary troops westward. The Israeli leadership now faced 3 fronts: Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Inside Israel, the mood was tense. Gas masks were distributed in cities. Schools converted basements into bomb shelters. For a nation of barely 2.5 million people, surrounded by enemies numbering over 100 million, the odds appeared impossible. On June 4, after weeks of uncertainty and international mediation that led nowhere, Israel's Security Cabinet gave the order at 7:45 a.m. On June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Focus, a preemptive strike designed to cripple the Egyptian Air Force before it could leave the ground. By the time Egyptian radar detected the incoming aircraft, the first wave of Israeli fighter bombers had already crossed the Mediterranean and descended into the Sinai. In less than 3 hours, the balance of power in the Middle East would be transformed. The 6-day war had begun. At precisely 7:45 a.m. on June 5, 1967, the quiet morning over Israel's southern bases broke with the roar of jet engines. The Israeli Air Force, under the command of Major General Motti Hod, had launched Operation Focus, one of the most precisely executed surprise airstrikes in military history. In the space of just 1 hour and 40 minutes, nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. Israeli Mirage Thekans, Super Mystères, and Vulture bombers flew barely 100 feet above the ground to avoid radar detection. Their targets, Egyptian airfields across the Sinai and Nile Delta, Inchas, Fayyid, Cairo West, Burgif Gaffa, and Abu Suwair. By mid-morning, over 300 Egyptian aircraft, including Soviet-built MiG-21S, MiG-19S, and Tu-16 bombers, lay in ruins, most still on their runways. Egyptian commanders, including Air Marshal Mahmoud Sidchi Mahmoud, were taken by complete surprise. Communications were in chaos. Radar stations had failed to warn of the incoming Israeli squadrons because many were off duty or jammed. By noon, Israel had also struck Syrian, Jordanian and Iraqi air bases, effectively grounding the entire Arab coalition's air power. Within 8 hours, the skies of the Middle East belonged to Israel. With air superiority achieved, Israel turned to its next objective, a full-scale ground assault on the Sinai Peninsula. Leading the charge was Major General Israel Tal, known simply as Talik, commander of the IDF's armored division in southern Sinai. He had trained his tank crews relentlessly, preparing for speed, coordination and precision. His forces consisted largely of British Centurion tanks and American M48 Patterns, upgraded for desert warfare. Facing him were Egypt's 7th Infantry Division and 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Abdel Aziz Suleiman and Major General Saad el-Din Morsi, entrenched in fortified defensive positions along the Sinai's central routes, Rafah, El Arish and Abu Ajila. The desert temperature soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit as Israeli armor advanced in 3 main columns. From the north, Brigadier General Avraham Yoffe's division moved toward El Arish, cutting off Egyptian supply lines. In the center, General Tal's own forces attacked Abu Ajila, one of Egypt's strongest fortifications. Further south, Brigadier General Ariel Sharon, a daring commander known for unconventional tactics, prepared a complex maneuver that would decide the fate of the battle. At Abu Ajila, Egyptian defenses were deeply layered: minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery batteries, and infantry bunkers stretching for miles. For years, Cairo had called it the wall that would stop Israel, but Tal and Sharon devised a plan that combined air, artillery, paratroopers and armor in a synchronized assault, something no army in the region had ever attempted. On the night of June 5, as Egyptian commanders still tried to comprehend the scale of the air attacks, Israeli artillery opened fire across the Sinai front. 155mm guns pounded the Egyptian trenches for over 3 hours. Meanwhile, Israeli paratroopers led by Colonel Danny Matt were secretly flown behind enemy lines to cut Egyptian supply routes and disrupt communication. At 3 a.m. on June 6, Israeli Centurions and M48 SES began moving forward. Their objective: break through the fortified line at Abu Ajila and clear the road to the Suez Canal. The night lit up with tracer fire and exploding shells. Tank crews fought at point-blank range. Visibility reduced to sand and smoke. Egyptian T-54s tried to counter-attack but lacked coordination. Israeli gunners, trained for rapid target acquisition, picked them off in the dark using infrared searchlights mounted on their tanks. By dawn, Israeli forces had penetrated deep into the Egyptian positions. Ariel Sharon's division encircled the Egyptian flanks, while paratroopers overran their artillery batteries. By midday on June 6, the Egyptian defensive line at Abu Ajila had collapsed. Hundreds of Egyptian soldiers surrendered. Others fled west toward the Suez Canal, abandoning tanks and vehicles along the way. It was the turning point of the entire Sinai campaign, one that military historians would later call a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. As Israeli columns pressed forward toward El Arish, the scale of Egypt's defeat became evident. By the end of the second day, Israeli forces had advanced more than 150 kilometers. The Sinai was falling fast. General Tal later remarked in an interview, "Speed was our greatest weapon. The desert rewards momentum. Once you stop, you're finished." By the evening of June 6, 1967, the Egyptian army was in full retreat. What had begun as a massive coalition prepared to crush Israel had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The war was only 2 days old, but already the map of the Middle East was being redrawn in fire and sand. By dawn on June 7, 1967, the desert battlefield stretched from El Arish to Bergafgafa, littered with the burned hulks of Soviet-built T-54 and T-55 tanks. The Egyptian army, shattered at Abu Ajila, was in chaotic withdrawal toward the Suez Canal. Israeli armor pressed the advantage. Major General Israel Tal's 84th Armored Division advanced west on the northern coastal road. Brigadier General Avraham Yoffe's forces pivoted through the central Sinai, sealing escape routes. Further south, Brigadier General Ariel Sharon's division cleared the Jebel Libni, Mitla Pass corridor, the gateway to the canal. For Israel's tank crews, it was a race against time to trap the retreating Egyptian divisions before they regrouped. Egypt's 2nd and 3rd armies, commanded by Lieutenant General Abdul Munim Riyad and Major General Saad el-Shazli, tried to reorganize scattered units, but communications were collapsing. Israeli airstrikes had destroyed field radios, bridges and fuel convoys. As the heat rose above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, the Sinai desert turned into a moving inferno of armor and dust. At El Arish, Tal's Centurion tanks caught Egypt's 7th Infantry Division in open terrain. Israeli gunners used superior optics and fire control systems to engage from longer range, often striking before Egyptian tanks could even traverse their turrets. Eyewitnesses described columns of black smoke stretching to the horizon. Meanwhile, in the central sector, Ariel Sharon's division executed one of the war's most daring maneuvers. Rather than attack Egyptian strongpoints head-on, Sharon swung his armor south, crossing uncharted desert to outflank the enemy. His units, including the 14th Armored Brigade under Colonel Amnon Reshaped, advanced through night and sandstorms using compass bearings alone. When dawn broke, they emerged behind the Egyptian defenses at Jebel Libni, cutting off entire regiments. By midday, June 7th, the Israeli Air Force rejoined the fight. Dassault Mystère IV's and Aragon's strafed Egyptian convoys along the Kontara, Ismailia Highway, leaving tanks stranded without fuel. In less than 48 hours, Israeli armored columns had reached the canal zone, capturing Bur Ghafghafa, Jebel Libni, and Qusayma. Egyptian resistance collapsed into isolated pockets. Some tank crews abandoned their vehicles and attempted to flee across the desert on foot. Others fought to the end. At Bur Lafan, an Egyptian T-55 battalion under Colonel Ahmed Hamed Ali held out for 8 hours against superior Israeli numbers before being overrun. By the evening of June 7th, the Sinai was effectively under Israeli control from Rafah in the north to the Gulf of Suez in the south. More than 800 Egyptian tanks had been destroyed or captured. Israel lost fewer than 100. Talik's forces reached the Suez Canal on June 8th, where Israeli troops stood on the east bank and gazed across to Africa, a sight no Israeli soldier had ever seen. At that moment, the war on the southern front was essentially decided. The once vaunted Egyptian army, supplied and trained by the Soviet Union, had been defeated in just 72 hours. But while the Sinai front fell silent, fighting erupted on 2 new fronts. To the east, Jordan's Arab Legion opened fire along the West Bank and Jerusalem, and to the north, Syrian tanks massed on the Golan Heights, overlooking Israel's northern settlements. The Israeli High Command now faced an agonizing decision: consolidate the Sinai victory or press forward on every front. Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and Prime Minister Levi Eshkol agreed that hesitation would invite renewed attacks. Orders went out before midnight: advance on all fronts. The next 48 hours would see tanks climbing mountains instead of dunes, and a nation fighting for its capital. As Israel's tanks reached the Suez Canal, a new battle ignited to the east. On the morning of June 5, 1967, while Israeli aircraft were striking Egypt, King Hussein of Jordan ordered his Arab Legion to open fire along the ceasefire lines of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Jordanian artillery, under Brigadier General Atta Ali Haya, shelled West Jerusalem, hitting the Knesset building, the Prime Minister's residence, and civilian neighborhoods. At the same time, Jordanian infantry seized Government House, the United Nations headquarters overlooking the city. Israel, hoping at first to avoid a second front, warned King Hussein through UN channels, "Do not attack. We will not strike first in Jerusalem." The warning was ignored. By noon, Jordanian forces had advanced into Ammunition Hill, Mount Scopus, and the old city's northern ramparts. Israeli paratroopers of the 55th Parachute Brigade, commanded by Colonel Mordecai Motti Hod, received orders to move. Their mission: retake the ridges around Jerusalem and open the road to the Old City. Through the night of June 6, 7, fierce close-quarters fighting erupted at Ammunition Hill. Israeli soldiers advanced trench by trench under heavy machine gun and mortar fire from entrenched Jordanian positions, commanded by Major Munib Masri. The battle lasted just under 4 hours. When it ended, 36 Israeli paratroopers and 71 Jordanian defenders lay dead. The hill was in Israeli hands. At dawn on June 7, Motti Hod radioed headquarters the words that would enter history: "Ha habayit biadi enu, the Temple Mount is in our hands." Israeli paratroopers entered the Old City through the Lion's Gate. For the first time since 1948, the Western Wall and the Temple Mount were under Israeli control. The image of soldiers weeping before the ancient stones became one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, armored divisions under Major General Uzi Narkis advanced rapidly toward Nablus and Jericho. By the evening of June 7, all Jordanian forces west of the River Jordan had withdrawn. Israel now controlled the entire West Bank, an area it had not planned to occupy at the start of the war. But the conflict was not over. To the north, Syria intensified shelling of Israeli villages from the heights above the Sea of Galilee. For 19 years, Syrian artillery had dominated the valley from the towering Golan Heights, a natural fortress rising more than 1,500 feet. On June 9, after repeated Syrian attacks, Israel's government authorized an assault on the Golan. The Northern Command under Major General David Elazar assembled 2 armored brigades, the 8th Armored Brigade, led by Colonel Albert Mandler, and the Golani Infantry Brigade. The terrain was steep, mined, and heavily fortified with Soviet-made bunkers. At 11:30 a.m., Israeli artillery opened fire across a 20-mile front, followed by tanks climbing the narrow Wasset and Zetouni passes under constant anti-tank fire. Casualties were heavy, but Israeli units pressed upward through smoke and broken rock. By nightfall, they had captured the key strongpoints of Tel Fakir, Tel Azaziyat, and Banias. Syria's defensive line collapsed the following morning. When Israeli forces reached Quneitra on June 10, the Syrian army was in retreat toward Damascus. At 6:30 p.m. local time, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. The 6-day war was over. In 6 days, Israel had seized territory 3 times its previous size: Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The strategic landscape of the Middle East had been transformed. But behind the maps and headlines lay a sobering reality: more than 20,000 Arab soldiers and 777 Israelis were dead. The swift victory stunned the world and ensured that the battles of June 1967 would shape every conflict that followed. By the evening of June 10, 1967, the guns had fallen silent. In just 132 hours, the Middle East had been transformed. Israel now held the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, a total of more than 42,000 square miles of captured territory, tripling its pre-war size. For Israel's military, it was the most decisive victory in modern history. For the Arab world, it was a catastrophe, known thereafter as Al-Naqsa, meaning the setback. In Cairo, President Gamal Abdel Nasser went on radio to announce Egypt's defeat. His voice was calm but heavy with exhaustion. "We have suffered a setback. I take full responsibility. I have decided to resign." Crowds poured into the streets, not in celebration, but in grief. Within hours, massive protests erupted demanding that Nasser stay in power. He withdrew his resignation, but Egypt's image as the leader of the Arab world was shattered. In Amman, King Hussein faced the loss of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Islam's third holiest city. He called it the darkest day in Arab history. Jordan's army, once among the most disciplined in the region, was now reduced to defending the east bank of the Jordan River. In Damascus, the mood was equally grim. The Syrian army had abandoned the Golan Heights after years of fortifying it with Soviet assistance. Soviet advisors reported to Moscow that the magnitude of defeat was total. Within weeks, the Soviet Union began rearming Egypt and Syria, setting the stage for future wars. In Israel, jubilation was tempered by shock. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol addressed the Knesset, "Our people stand in awe of the valor of our sons and daughters. But we must not let victory blind us to the heavy price paid in blood." 777 Israelis had been killed, and more than 2,500 wounded. Every family knew someone lost or injured. But the military achievement was staggering. For the first time since 1948, Israel controlled defensible borders. Jerusalem was reunited. The Sinai and Golan provided natural barriers against future invasion. At the same time, the territorial gains created new political dilemmas. Israel now governed more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, an occupation that would become the center of global debate for decades. While the United States privately congratulated Israel on its victory, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from territories captured in the conflict in exchange for peace. Yet, the Arab League, meeting in Khartoum, Sudan in August 1967, declared the famous three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. The prospect of reconciliation vanished almost as quickly as the war had been won. In military academies around the world, from West Point to Sandhurst, the Six-Day War became a case study in strategy and execution. The keys to victory were clear: surprise, mobility, and air superiority. But historians also noted the deeper cause: preparation. The IDF had trained obsessively, studied every previous battle, and learned to coordinate across branches: air, armor, artillery, and intelligence. When the moment came, every soldier knew his role. For the Arab armies, the lessons were painful. Their Soviet-style command structures were rigid, centralized, and slow to adapt. Egyptian field reports later revealed that entire units went days without orders, once communications were destroyed. By the end of June 1967, the world order in the Middle East had shifted irreversibly. The United States and Soviet Union, already locked in the Cold War, saw the region as a new stage for influence, arming and training rival sides for years to come. But beyond the politics and maps lay the human toll. Tens of thousands of families were displaced across the Sinai, the Golan, and the West Bank. Refugee camps expanded overnight. For civilians on all sides, the six-day storm left scars that would last generations. From the silence over the Sinai dunes to the prayers whispered at the Western Wall, the echoes of June 1967 reached every corner of the Middle East. It was a victory measured not only in miles and machines, but in memory. When the sun rose over the Middle East on June 11, 1967, a fragile ceasefire held, but the world that existed a week earlier was gone forever. The Six-Day War had redrawn borders, redefined armies, and rewritten history itself. For Israel, the victory became a defining national moment, proof that preparation, unity, and intelligence could overcome overwhelming odds. The young state, less than 20 years old, had faced the combined militaries of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, supported by Iraq and other Arab allies, and emerged victorious. Yet that triumph came with a new burden: the control of vast territories populated by more than 1 million Palestinians, and the international debate that followed. Within months, Israel began establishing military administrations across the West Bank, Gaza, and Sinai. Jerusalem was formally unified under Israeli law, and Jewish access to the Western Wall was restored for the first time since 1948. But the exhilaration of June was soon shadowed by uneasy questions: what to do with the land, and how to secure peace without surrendering it. In the Arab world, the defeat was devastating. Across Cairo, Damascus, and Amman, governments faced public outrage and humiliation. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, once the symbol of Arab nationalism, saw his dream of pan-Arab unity collapse overnight. He began rebuilding Egypt's army almost immediately, with Soviet assistance, receiving new MiG-21S, T-62 tanks, and surface-to-air missiles. That rearmament would lead directly to the War of Attrition 1969, 1970, and later, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In Jordan, King Hussein turned inward, focusing on stability and the survival of his monarchy after losing East Jerusalem and the West Bank. In Syria, the humiliation of the Golan Heights loss fueled a new wave of radical politics and eventual rise of Hafez al-Assad, who seized power in 1970 and rebuilt the Syrian military with Soviet aid. The human impact was immense. More than 300,000 Palestinians fled or were displaced during the war, many becoming refugees for a second time since 1948. Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian families searched for missing sons who had vanished in the desert. For civilians across the region, the Six-Day War was not 6 days at all, it was a lifetime of loss. Internationally, the conflict reshaped alliances. The United States drew closer to Israel, recognizing its strategic importance in a Soviet-influenced region. The USSR, in turn, deepened support for Egypt and Syria, supplying billions in arms over the next decade. The Middle East became one of the most militarized zones on Earth, where every ceasefire was temporary and every peace was fragile. Yet, out of the chaos came new diplomacy. By 1979, Egypt, under President Anwar Sadat, would sign the Camp David Accords with Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin, formally ending 3 decades of war. That peace treaty returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, a territory first captured in those 6 days of June 1967. Historians often describe the Six-Day War as a paradox, a short conflict that never really ended. It reshaped Israel's identity, redefined Arab nationalism, and set in motion disputes that endure to this day. Its lessons are studied in every military academy: the value of preparation, the speed of execution, and the cost of victory. But beyond the strategy and statistics lies a quieter truth: the war's human legacy. For every commander remembered, there were thousands of soldiers who never returned. For every map redrawn, there were families divided by new borders. And for every victory celebrated, there were memories that refused to fade. Standing on the dunes of Sinai years later, General Israel Tal, the armored commander whose tanks had crossed the desert in 1967, was asked what he remembered most. He paused and said simply, "Not the speed, not the speed, not the triumph. The silence, after it was over." More than half a century later, that silence still echoes, across the sands of Sinai, over the hills of Golan, and through the streets of Jerusalem, reminding the world that even the swiftest wars leave shadows that endure far longer than 6 days.